Intuitives, another pre-work video that I wanted to get out, and I haven't done a narcissistic tactic video in a little while, and one of their tactics has been recurring in my mind, and I wanted to try to get my thoughts out on it. So, hope this helps for those of you, sadly, who, like me, are familiar with narcissistic abuse and had to suffer its ill effects, which get a lot better when you get away, but it takes time for it to completely go away, as you have to understand it first, and that takes time. Revelation as to how messed up it was typically comes once you're out of that environment and it ceases to be normalized. Now, the tactic I want to talk about today that narcissists use a lot is the "but it's tradition." So the idea of what they're doing, if they can't defend it in any way, shape, or form as right or okay, they'll hide behind, "but that's the way we've always done it," as if it's like permanently grandfathered in. And in my situation, in Chestertology, it seems to most often occur this sense of "but it's tradition" or "that's the way we've always done it" always comes up when anything from the 80s is challenged. So, to these narcissistic boomers in my family, to them, like, 1980s Chester County was Camelot. And there's no, everything was perfect. And to question or try to change anything from the way it functioned in that era is not only a high crime, but utter blasphemy of their religion. But narcissists will sorry, nasal drip. Narcissists will use uh, any tactic they can to try to justify their control of you and their abuse of you, and hiding behind tradition is one of them. And you can see this throughout society in terms of things that are straight up narcissistic, like good old boys clubs and old boys clubs are often justified by the "it's tradition." Well, that's the way, we've always done it. Well, that's always how it's been in the past. His daddy had the job, now he get the job. Ain't none of that qualification shit. It just, job passed down from one person to another. It's like, what is this, a hereditary? I didn't know, police badges were in America work the same way as hereditary peerage in the House of Lords, which needs to end, by the way. I'll do a video on that because it makes no sense to me, and those of you from the UK that watch my videos must explain it to me. Anyway, because that is the granddaddy of all old boys clubs, at least ones that are still in existence today. They'll hide behind that, so they'll use tradition to justify things like nepotism, cronyism, corruption, since they can't justify the actions itself. But tradition, and remember, status quo good, change bad. Another big one that I'm intimately familiar with, and I'll put the link as to why, is often bullying and hazing is justified as tradition. Yeah. However, when you dig deeper into it, you realize that usually the ones that are doing the bullying and hazing were not subjected to it themselves. They may have known someone else who was, but they themselves were not subjected to it. And oftentimes, too, in the bullying and hazing aspect, a lot of people will fall back on the, "well, in the military." Funny enough, when encountering bullying and hazing, like, say, I don't know, in a fire department, it's the veterans are the ones to say this is fucked up and needs to change and this isn't right, and will speak out. Usually the ones trying to play the military card along with the tradition card is usually, A, good old boys, but B, guys who never served. So it's like, isn't it kind of funny how, those that try to, use the tough military, card are ones that were never in the military, when people that were in the military, like, for instance, the Air Force and the Coast Guard and the Marines, not that I'm citing specific people who were in the military who spoke out against bullying and hazing that were in those branches, but it's people like that say this should not be tolerated, and they help report it. But that is often justified as tradition, as that's the way we've always done it. We've done it this way for 20 years. It's like, no, you haven't, and no, you haven't, not really. And it used to be applied equally. It's interesting too, um, to think that perhaps, in theory, the uptick of bullying and hazing in, say, fire academies, there was an uptick of it in the early 2000s, right around the time when fire departments were getting more female applicants and thus more females in the recruit classes and going through the academy. It's almost as if, oh, the good old boys didn't want them there. Gee, I wonder why. And it's a nice segue into my next point. Exploitation, sexual exploitation, or working long hours with unsafe conditions, or not providing things like mandatory breaks, like every 5 hours you're supposed to get 15 minutes, for example. Not paying overtime when you're legally obligated to. Those are other things that often get, protected by tradition. Well, done back in the day, we no, you didn't. There'll be some wild story about how unsafe things were, but again, ironically enough, those that are trying to play the tradition card there, it's like, wait a minute, boomer. It's like, yeah, the conditions you're speaking of did exist at one time, but that was in the 30s. You weren't alive in the 30s. That's always another good one. It's like some person is trying to justify like blatant, like actual dangerous safety hazards, like, I don't know, being up in the bucket of a backhoe that's covered in ice using a pole saw by power lines to limb a tree when you have like no safety harness at all. And they'll talk about how, in the old days, guys used to do this dangerous job and that dangerous job. It's like, not in your day, motherfucker. Like, that's a common theme I've known with the boomers. Like, anything that their parents did, they try to claim it as their own. Our generation put a man on the moon. Like, really? The oldest one of your generation was 23 at the time. None of the astronauts or the men in mission control were of the boomer generation, but somehow your generation, made that a reality, even though NASA and saying we were going to the moon was JFK, who was older than a boomer, but they watched it on TV, so it's theirs. I guess my generation brought down the Berlin Wall. I mean, I remember it on TV. But tradition will often be used in the workplace as well to justify, not paying you a fair wage. And they'll try to say, oh, I only made this back in the day. It's like inflation. Like, I had one guy who said, well, when my father was a bar manager in 1950, he only made $2 an hour. How would you like to survive on that? And then you figure out, you do the inflation. And it's like, in 1950, $2 an hour would be like 25, 30 today. It's like, he wasn't doing that bad. Like, that's, it's like, yeah, I'd like very much to make that equivalency today. So, paying women less money, that often gets used by tradition, like, this a man's job kind of thing. Like, it don't matter how good you do it. See, girlie, just because you can do the job better than Goober over there, Goober Uncle did the job, so, Goober entitled to it. We very meritocratic here. Goober Uncle, good worker. Goober can be fuck off, but he get a pass. Shit like that. Exploiting women sexually in the workplace, blatantly, that gets excused with tradition often because, well, done back in the day, you'd be able to slap her head. I'd say you do a good job. Yeah, you lucky to be here with us. This is our club. Kind of shit like that. And, I use a, more rural accent because that's what I encounter here in Chester County. The same exists, you could say a lot of these same things with like very posh London accents as well. I just can't really do it. So, but I'm saying it does this idea of hiding behind tradition to excuse various acts of narcissism is not limited to class at all. It is not. So, what the narcissist is trying to do in this instance is to basically tell you that nothing can ever change. If something is ingrained in the status quo, no matter how wrong it is, you can't change it because it is thus protected by the idea of tradition. And in their minds, or what they at least try to say, is tradition is always good. Tradition must be upheld. You know, anything from the old days is by definition the best, especially if it's, like I said, like the 80s or the 70s, like their heyday. Because in the minds of narcissistic baby boomers, when they were in their prime, that was Camelot. That was human civilization at its peak, and it must not be altered from. I would say the 80s, because we still had Keynesian demand side economics in the 1970s, and they obviously, the vast majority of them are against that, because after all, greed is good in their minds, and whoever dies with the most toys wins. So understand, when a narcissist is using the "it's tradition" excuse, they know they can't justify what they're doing to you. There is no rational way to explain it. What they're trying to do is hide behind the fact of, well, we got away with doing this stuff for so long, we should still get away with it because the rules don't apply to me. You know, how dare you get to challenge anything that I tell you to do? You can't say no, and if I say it's tradition, that means it's unquestionable. And how dare you're lucky I'm even willing to abuse you, that I give you the time of day. Me, a glorious baby boomer who the seas part for me, and I should be gilded in gold and diamonds and paraded down the street as people bow their head in reverence to such greatness. That's what you're dealing with when a narcissist tries to hide behind tradition. They think anything they believe is by definition right, and even if modern society has long since proven how their tradition is exploitative, wrong, abusive, etc., they'll still try to justify it because anything from their golden era is by definition the best, and the world must return to that because, change makes them uncomfortable, and, the world exists to make boomers comfortable after all. So understand, tradition is not an excuse, does not excuse abuse. We must keep moving forward, and to do that, you must change the status quo and challenge things that are justified solely on tradition.